Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about why when you're using a grinder that people turn around and say, oh, one side grinds more than the other side, the teeth are uneven. Well, the teeth can be uneven from manufacture as well. Let me tell you that. So much so that this is a brand new RS chain from Still, never been used, and I took my Mitutoyo digital caliper. I measured every tooth on the left side. I measured every tooth on the right side. On the left side, the lowest or the shortest tooth was 9.56 and the longest tooth was 10.05. So we had a 0.5 millimetre difference. On the right side, the lowest was 9.7 and the highest was 10.13, so 0.43 of a millimetre. So you can expect a brand new chain to be out by 0.5 millimetre. Now, mind you, their production line is worth millions of dollars and they can't get it perfectly right. So 0.5 millimetre, that's actually quite a lot from one of the world's, if not the world's, largest chain manufacturer of, precision chain. 0.5 millimetre out. That's actually quite a lot. I would have expected a lot better than that. So therefore, from manufacture, you can find out that it's out. Now, if you take this chain and you cut wood and you find out that you've got to sharpen it. Well, let's just say you sharpen it on the lowest tooth first. It means that you're going to take off, if you're 0.5 millimetre out from the beginning, you want to hope that your grinder's set up properly, because you could be more than 1 millimetre out if you don't have this all set up properly. So how can you make sure that this is set up properly? Well, first of all, what you need to make sure of, that really can make a difference, that the backstop, now the backstop normally has a slight radius on it. It really should be put in the middle of the tooth. So if you view the tooth from the back, the one closest to the operator is a right-hand tooth and the tooth at the closest to the grinder is a left-hand tooth. So the other thing to check, what I like to do with this backstop, is sometimes make sure that it may have a slight radius on it, but a lot of times I'll run a file over the top and get it perfectly flat, dead level. So in other words, I make sure that the edge of that is dead straight, not this way or not that way, because if it's not perfectly straight, and also on the shaft, so if you look at the shaft on here, make sure that that's lined up and that's not bent this way or bent that way, because this shaft could be bent this way or that way. So it's just something that you can check to make sure before you even start. So the best way to make sure that your grinder is working properly and it's properly set up, if we were to sharpen this chain and we were going to do the tooth facing the inside, the back of the grinder, I will move this backstop roughly in the middle of the tooth, right? So that the backstop is right in the middle, and if we zoom in there, hopefully you can see that. Something like that, right? Roughly in the middle. It could go over slightly more, because if you do that in the middle, right, there's right in the middle. So you set it up like that, lock it in a position, right? Bring the grinding wheel down. It's set up for that tooth. Turn this to 30 degrees, because that's what I normally use, right? Bring the grinding wheel down so we'll just see whether you can see that. I've just turned in the wheel. It's just barely touching, right? So that's where you start to grind, right? And then you may make an adjustment on here if it doesn't grind the whole tooth uniform. That's the locking nut. You may go in slightly till you get it right. Now, you don't know whether you're starting on your highest tooth or your longest tooth, or you're starting on your shortest tooth. So if you're starting on your longest tooth, then it may not even grind your shortest tooth, because as we just saw, they can be out by 1/2 millimetre. So just bear that in mind, right? Okay, let's just say that you've made all the adjustments on here. You've ground the tooth, and it's a good idea that you check it in a few other spots, and then you're pretty confident that you've got a pretty good average. So you start grinding all the left-hand side. Take the chain off, you inspect it. You may find out that there's a few short teeth, as I discussed previously before. I wouldn't grind them too much. I'd touch them a little bit, maybe more, just a touch, because you want to try and get all the teeth roughly the same length. Not that that's going to have a huge effect. It's not going to make it cut crooked if it's out a tiny little bit. But for future sharpenings, if they're all approximately the same length, you'll get much more longevity out of the chain. So let's just say that you've taken the minimum amount of metal off your tooth. So if we say that it ranged anywhere from 9.5 to 10 millimetres, that's 1/2 millimetre in length, and you've done your first sharpening, hopefully it's going to be somewhere around about 9.4 millimetres, right? Because if your lowest tooth is 9.5, 9.56 that I measured, you'd get away with about 9.4. So let's just say every tooth is approximately 9.4 millimetres, give or take. Now, when you go to the other side, right, so let's just say you're finished with the left side here and you want to go to the right side, you'll notice that this backstop is nowhere in the middle because we moved it on the middle for that tooth. So what you need to do is loosen this and put that in the middle, and that way it's sitting in exactly the same position. Now, again, you'll have to change the angle back to 30 degrees, and when you bring the grinding wheel in, look at that, it's just touching. I'll just lock that in a position, tighten it all up. It's out a little bit, so not by much. So I just had to probably turn that about 1/8 of a turn. Don't be too concerned about that, because you're talking about a grinder that's worth a couple of $100. If still are manufacturing millions of chains and they have an error of 1/2 millimetre, the error in my grinder, I believe, is probably no more than about 0.2 of a millimetre. If you set this up correctly, right? Make sure that you set the backstop up correctly. Because if you your starting point is that the wheel just kisses the tooth, and then you slowly increase until you can start to see some more sparks. Practice will dictate the method. So the better you get at it, the better you've got a feel of how much to adjust this. And when you're grinding this tooth, you don't know whether it's the longest tooth in the chain or the shortest tooth. So they're my tips in doing that. Don't always blame the grinder. because I can guarantee you that I've just found a 0.5 millimetre difference between the shortest tooth and the longest tooth on a Stihl RS chain. So even the factory ground chains are out of spec. Now, how many times, if you watch a Stihl video and you're hand filing, they'll tell you, and you see the guy, he's got a digital caliper and he's measuring every tooth. You've got to be joking. You don't have to do that. I just did that for demonstration purposes to turn around and say, hey, I've measured a brand new chain. I've found out that that chain, the specifications, it's got a tolerance. The length tolerance is out by 0.5 millimetre. So don't blame your grinder. A lot of the times it's the operator. So just to briefly recap, you'll find out that the pivot point, which is this bolt that goes right through the middle, is pretty dead on in machinery, right? So they would have manufactured this. It's pretty spot on. It may be out by a couple of thou here and there, so that's neither here nor there. It's nothing to worry about. So this turntable, if we can call it a turntable, will pivot, and it does. It pivots fairly uniform where the point of the tooth is. Unlike the Stihl has an offset of about 20 millimetres on a brand new tooth. So this doesn't have an offset. It sits right on the pivot point. So therefore, there is a white line that I've got on the grinding wheel, and when I put that into the centre position so it lines up perfectly, and I move the table across the face of the wheel, the point of the tooth stays pretty much where that line is. There's a little bit of a movement over the face, but not much. And that way I know that everything on the vise, the whole setup is good. As I said, this is a cheap grinder, but it is got great specifications and accuracy. When they stamp out these links and everything else, there's millions and millions and millions. Then it goes on to a special grinder that grinds the tooth before it's assembled. That's what I believe, I was told. And that's how they can get their square ground done really accurately. But even I've looked at square ground, and where the square ground goes, you'll see a grinding mark that's supposed to go right in the middle of the point of the tooth. I've even seen that out on Stihl chains. It's not perfect. And yeah, I wonder if I could demonstrate that. No, it's not a square ground chain. I don't have the square grounds, not just here with me at the moment. But when you square ground, at the corner of the tooth, you will see a line that intersects at that point. A lot of times the line can be off that way or it can be off that way. It means that the grinder didn't grind perfectly at the intersecting point. It's one of the hardest things to do on square ground, even if you do it by file. So I've seen many brand new chains that are nowhere near perfect or ground perfect, right? So that's just to let you know that out of the box, they may be 90%, not 100%. So don't blame yourself or your grinder, because a lot of times it's not the grinder, it's the operator. So the main point of focus here is that you set up one side first so that adjust the backstop so that it pushes the tooth forward so that it just kisses the wheel when the clamp is locked. And then you increase this until you're taking minimal material off until you've got a nice sharp tooth. Do it nice and slowly. Bring the wheel down, not just bring it down and hold it, bring it down a tap-in motion, off, on. That way you'll find out that you grind the tooth in a cool mode. If you hold this down like that, it'll generate too much heat and you'll ruin the temper. You'll get blue teeth. You don't want to do that. When you've done that one side and you're happy with that one side, you need to reposition this on the tooth closest to you. Just got to make sure that the tooth, behind the tooth, that this sits roughly in the middle of the tooth. And if it sits in the middle of the tooth, you'll find out that this shouldn't be too far away from kissing the tooth. But as I said before, that if we set up on the left side, and let's just say your first tooth was a little bit longer, and then we set up on this side, and the first tooth that you ground or set up on was the shorter one. Well, there's going to be a discrepancy, isn't there? Now, you could, if you wanted to, have a brief check of the tooth with a caliper, just to say, okay, this has got an average of 10 millimetres in length, or the average is 9.7 millimetres in length. So you might want to set up on a shorter tooth, 9.7 mil. It just means that you're going to grind a little bit more on that 10 millimetre tooth. So you could do it that way, or you could just do it any way you want to do it. But it's more time consuming to use a vernier just to turn around and say, hey, this is the longest tooth, this is the shortest tooth. I only did that to demonstrate because I wanted to show that there is variation on a brand new chain. So don't blame yourself for that variation. If you turn around and say that my left side or my right side is longer by 2 millimetres, then that would definitely be a user error. You did something wrong. You didn't set it up properly. Because if you set it up properly, I believe that you should be able to get no more than the error of what they've got, 0.5 millimetre. And that's quite acceptable. If you've got a brand new chain that's got a 0.5 millimetre tolerance in it, and you're keeping it at 0.5 millimetre, well, you're doing okay. I wouldn't worry too much if it was out a little bit. The only thing that I would suggest is that if you're using the standard long flat gauge, which is a constant gauge, it's okay when the tooth's brand new. But as the tooth wears down, you really need to be using the progressive depth gauge, because the progressive depth gauge will compensate for different length teeth. You need to be using this gauge. So you really do need to at least check after you sharpen any chain. I just put that on, I run it over a couple of teeth. If I can't feel it taking anything off, then I can assume that I sharpened this chain before, but I can't remember whether I sharpened it or when I sharpened it, because I've got too many chains to remember, hey, I did this last week or the week before. So because of the many different chainsaws and chains that I have, and I like to have about 5 or 6 chains for each chainsaw, given the different bar lengths. So I've got chains hanging around all over the place, and that's why I can't remember when I checked the rakers last on any specific chain. So every time I sharpen a chain, it doesn't mean I'll do the rakers, but it means that I will check them. And if I file over 3-4 tooth and nothing comes off, I goes, oh, I must have checked that last time I sharpened it. So that's what I do on every single chain. And I believe that my techniques, that I get the chains razor sharp. And by taking it slowly is probably the secret. Too many people just grab the grinder, pull it down and hold it, and it's not a very good grind when you do that. If you grind slower, you'll get a much better surface finish. Right? You can't take any piece of metal, even if you go to a bench grinder like this, right? So that's a very fine stone, the white stone, and that's much rougher. Then we've got a belt sander here. That's very coarse. So if I was to use this bench grinder and just take a piece of metal like this and put too much pressure on it, it's going to overheat. It'll be a shit finish. But if I take my time and put a little bit of pressure on it, I'll end up with a much better surface finish. And if you ever used a surface grinder, you get a mirror finish on them. They are beautiful because it's a fine wheel and it goes nice and slow. A surface grinder will just go like this, about this speed. But it takes very little off as it goes over the top. So irrespective of whether you've got 60 grit, 80 grit or 100 grit, when you pull this down, pull it down slowly and just slowly grind into the tooth. Just let it grind its own way, nice and slow. You'll end up with a beautiful, nice finish. Burrs are unavoidable. The only other thing that can hamper tooth sharpening is that a grinder on the left-hand tooth, you're grinding from the inside to the outside due to the rotation of the wheel. On a right-hand tooth that's on the outside, the grinder is grinding from the outside to the inside. You get a much better finish that way. So to briefly recap on all of this, if the manufacturer is selling a brand new chain and the tolerance is 0.5 millimetre between the longest tooth and the shortest tooth, that's actually quite a lot, considering that they've got multi-million-dollar production lines. I would have thought that they'd be as good as 0.1 of a millimetre, but they're not. So therefore, just remember that when you set up the left side, or if you set up the right side, whatever side that you grind first, you have to set up the other side the same. Take the time to make sure that you adjust the backstop to make sure that it's behind the tooth, right in the middle, and set it up so that the tooth kisses the wheel. So you need to set it up twice. You set it up for the left side, you set it up for the right side. One mistake people make, they set it up for one side and then they just switch over to the scale and they continue grinding. That's not the correct way to do it. You've got to set it up for both sides because you want to take off the same amount of metal off each tooth. So if you don't take time to set it up, then, yeah, don't whinge and complain when you go, oh, one side's shorter than the other. Operator error. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye for now.